I want to welcome everybody to this webinar on complaint handling, how to avoid the third most common reason for FDA 483 observations. My name is Michael Drews. I want to also thank my many friends at Greenlight for the opportunity to conduct this webinar today. Just a quick addition to what Lisa just said about me. In addition to consulting for a wide variety of medical device companies, I also work as a consultant for the FDA, as well as Health Canada and a few of the other regulatory bodies around the world. And the reason why I mention that, quite frankly, is because there's not a lot of people that can say that work on both sides of that proverbial fence, and I really try to use that to my advantage. And the other thing that I just want to remind everybody of, some of you know this already, is I am an active participant, not just with Greenlight and their medical device podcast series, but with other organizations as well. You can see some of the organizations that I contribute to on the screen now. By the way, this slide will be in the handout that will be provided to you after the webinar is over. If you don't get that for whatever reason, then send me an email and I can send it to you directly. So here's what I'd like to cover in the fairly short time that we have today about complaint handling. And by the way, for those of you that might be interested, I teach an entire short course, a 2-day short course on post-market surveillance and complaint handling. This is just going to be sort of a small excerpt of that. If you're interested in more, certainly if you're working in the area of complaints, probably more than today's webinar is going to be necessary. Send me an email and I'll be happy to send you information about that course. It's a 2-day course. It's offered virtually, so you don't have to travel anywhere. So the topics that I want to talk about today are, first of all, what is a complaint? What do you do with this complaint information? I hope you do something with it, but as we're going to see, that doesn't always happen. How does something called medical device underreporting impact complaint handling? How do you properly and adequately investigate complaints in order to avoid 483s? And by the way, I love when you see in regulation phrases like properly and adequately, because what the heck does that mean? Can complaints be positive? I find it kind of unfortunate that we use the word complaint and that has an inherent negative connotation to it. I think that we should back off from thinking of this in a negative way by using the word complaint and instead just say something like feedback, which is more neutral, because as we'll talk about, the feedback, the complaints, if you will, can be both positive as well as negative. And then just a tiny bit about what are some of the complaint handling challenges for the future. For those of you that have that either know me or have heard some of my webinars or podcasts before, you know that unlike a lot of other regulatory folks who are constantly backwards looking, who are looking at what we've been doing in the past, I'm always thinking about and working on what we are doing for the future. So what are some of the challenges when it comes to complaint handling for the future? And then I threw in a bonus question. Hopefully I'll have time to at least talk about it a little bit. When should a complaint initiate a CAPA? This is one of the reasons why a lot of companies get in trouble. And quite frankly, this is not a QSR, a quality system regulation requirement, but perhaps it should be. So I'll give you some thoughts on that. And then I'm going to share with you throughout our time today a laundry list of tips and tricks, and wrap up with some final thoughts, and hopefully have a little time for some Q&A at the end. So as a reminder, as Lisa said, please feel free to type your questions into the chat window. You don't have to wait until the end of the webinar to do so. Anytime you think about them, you can go ahead and put them in. So let's start out. First of all, what's the inspiration for this particular webinar? Most people, they would think that, something like complaint handling would be a topic that's, well, A, pretty straightforward, and B, inherently boring. So what's the point of doing an entire webinar on complaint handling? Well, let me share with you the top 10 reasons. For those of you that remember the TV show, the David Letterman show, he was famous or infamous for his top 10 lists. So this is kind of patterned after that. The top 10 reasons that companies get 483 observations. The big three are CAPAs, corrective actions, preventative actions. Those account for about 12.5% of all 43 observations and many warning letters that FDA issues every year. Design controls, just shy of that, a little over 12%. And then the number 3 on the list, not too far behind, about 10.5%, is complaints or complaint handling. And collectively, pardon me, collectively, those 3 reasons, CAPAs, design controls, and complaints, represent a little over a third of all of the causes cited in medical device 483s and many warning letters as well, issued in last year in 2022, as well as we'll see in a moment for many years before. Regrettably, this is not a new trend. So just if you're curious, to round out the list of the top 10, the other ones that are included, the most common reasons why companies get 43 observations are purchasing controls, process validation, medical device reporting, non-conforming products, production and process controls, adaptance activities, and finally, quality audits. These are the top 10. As I said, the top 3, CAPA, design controls, and complaints, represent about a third, a little over a third of all of the 43s. And therefore, we're going to be focusing on the third one, complaints, in this particular webinar, and hoping to do a bit more of a deeper dive into that. What's the message here, though? Broadly speaking, these top 10 lists that I have on the screen now, this accounts for 75% of all of the 483 observations that FDA issued in last calendar year. Is this a new trend? I wish I could say that it was. In fact, it's absolutely not a new trend. Approximately a third of all medical device 483 citations over the last 13 years were caused by design controls, CAPAs, and complaints. And actually, this trend has continued for the past 16 of the last 17 years. Regrettably, and I don't like to say this about my own industry, but somebody has to, we keep making the same mistakes over and over and over again. It reminds me of the adage, many of you have probably heard of it before, practice makes perfect. Well, it's actually not true. Practice does not make perfect. Perfect practice makes perfect. And there's a big difference. If you keep practicing something, but you continue to do it wrong, you're going to get very, very good at doing it wrong. I think the data that you see on the screen right now is a classic example of evidence that our industry is practicing it over and over again and getting very, very good at doing it wrong. Because if they didn't, and again, I don't take any pleasure in saying this about my own industry, but if they didn't, then how would we explain these statistics? And I also wanted to just point out the irony, dare I say it, the hypocrisy, because we're not going to talk about it in detail today, but one of the regulations, one of the regulatory requirements under the topic of complaint handling is trending and trend analysis. We're supposed to trend, we're supposed to track, we're supposed to do various statistical analyses for our complaints to try to see patterns as early as we can. And yet, where is this same trend analysis, if you will, on the data that we have on the screen right now? Again, I don't want to belabor this point, but I do think it's an important one. The top 3 areas that companies have gotten 483s, in many cases warning letters as well, design controls, CAPAs, and complaints, they have remained the same for the last 16 of the past 17 years. That, to me, doesn't require a PhD in statistics after your name. That means that there's a trend there. And we should do something about it. We should recognize it. Einstein said that, and this is a slightly different version of his common definition of insanity is repeating the same mistakes over and over and over again and expecting a different result. Once again, I take no pride in saying this about my industry, but our industry seems to be getting very good at repeating the same mistakes over and over and expecting a different result. Okay, so enough bashing. Let's talk about how we can improve the status quo. And by the way, if you want more on the statistics that I just shared with you, I've done several podcasts on this. The most recent one, the most current one, just earlier this year on Greenlight Guru's website, called the most common problems found during FDA inspections in 2022. You can go to Greenlight's website and access it, or if you have a problem finding it, just send me an email. I'll be happy to send you the link. So because we want to focus specifically on complaints, let's drill in further into the complaint-related 43 observations. In other words, what were the most common reasons why companies got 43 observations specifically in the area of complaints? So here are some real, not hypothetical, but actual examples of why companies got 43s based on complaints. The manufacturer did not document their procedures. Some of these I find hard to believe, by the way. I mean, can anybody work in this industry without understanding the importance of documentation? And it's not a matter of FDA saying you didn't adequately document your procedure. They're saying they didn't document the procedure at all, because there's a lot of gray area. You know, when somebody says you didn't adequately document your procedure, okay, there's a lot of gray area that's open to interpretation. But if somebody says you didn't document your procedure, period, that's a problem. That's one of the most common reasons why companies get 43s under the topic of under the category of complaints. The next one is a manufacturer did not maintain their complaint files. In other words, they didn't keep them current, or maybe FDA knew of complaints that were not entered into the company system properly or whatever. So what's the point of having a complaint handling system if you're not going to maintain it? I mean, to me, these are just statements of the obvious, but it's just amazing to me how many companies get in trouble because of this. Complaints of device failures were not investigated. Now, never mind as a regulatory consultant, as a professional biomedical engineer, this just makes my blood pressure go up. I mean, if a company has a report of a device that actually fails, and yes, I stipulate that the word failure can be, mean many, many different things. But if they have a complaint that the device fails, don't they have an obligation to investigate it? Or at the very least, if it doesn't need to be investigated, they have an obligation to explain why that this doesn't need to be investigated. All right. But other than that, I find it, to be blunt here, I find it unconscionable that a company or people in that company working in this industry would not investigate a report of a failure. That's one of the most common reasons, regrettably. Complaints were not reviewed and evaluated to determine if an investigation was necessary, or it lacked a rationale for not conducting an investigation. Again, another common reason why companies get 43s under the topic of complaint handling. And as I'll talk about more in a few minutes, if you have a complaint, and again, I'm putting that word in air quotes because a complaint doesn't necessarily have to be negative. It can be feedback. It can be information. But if you get a complaint, if you get a piece of information from one of your customers or somebody else about one of your products, and you feel that it's not necessary to investigate it further, okay, fine, there's no problem with that. But you need to document the fact that it's not necessary. And I'm not talking about creating a 300-page PhD dissertation. It might be just a couple of sentences or a couple of paragraphs. And again, there is a regulatory requirement for this. I'll show you in a moment. But a couple of sentences basically explaining, here's the piece of information that we received, the complaint, if you will. Here are the reasons why we're not investigating it. And then, you have the people from the company who made that decision sign off and put their date on it, and they're done. But to just simply say that it was not investigated, that's a problem. Complaints that were deemed reportable were not promptly investigated. It's a little beyond the scope of this particular webinar, but there are regulatory requirements, reporting requirements, depending on the nature of the complaint or the nature of the MDR, the medical device report, how long you have until you report it to the FDA. Sometimes for less severe kind of a problems, it might be 30 days or even longer. Sometimes for more severe problems, you might have just 5 days. So again, that's not something that we're going to get into in detail in this particular webinar, but those requirements exist. And it is something that I talk about in much more detail in the expanded course that I mentioned earlier. Complaint records did not contain required information. Sometimes I look at documentation and it's like, did you go to elementary school? Did you learn to put your name and the date on your paper? But it's just amazing to me how many people don't put some of the most basic information on there. So these are the most common reasons why companies get 483s under the umbrella of complaint handling. And as I've alluded to a moment ago, I personally find it very, very difficult to explain or to rationalize or to justify most, if not all of these. To me, this is all common sense, and these are just incredibly boneheaded mistakes that companies are making. What's the root cause? And I'm going to come back to the specific topic of complaints in just a couple of seconds. But what's the root cause of not just most complaints, but recalls and warning letters and so on and so on? It's when people follow the rules without actually thinking. This is what I call the tick box mentality. So many people, and again, I'm stereotyping here, I'm generalizing, there are obviously many exceptions, but many people seem to be more concerned with just simply, checking off the boxes on the form as opposed to thinking about what they're really doing, or more importantly, why they're doing it. After all, Douglas MacArthur said that rules are mostly made to be broken and are too often for the lazy to hide behind. Now, please don't miss my message here. I'm not saying don't follow the rules. I'm not saying rules are not important. I'm certainly not advocating anarchy. But if the rules, what I'm saying is this: if the rules make sense, then follow them. But if the rules don't make sense and we follow them anyway, and we agree with that they don't make sense and we follow them anyway, is that a problem with the system, or is that a problem with us? Something to think about. By the way, I love when I use this particular slide when I show it at conferences like RAPS or other regulatory or quality conferences. This slide, usually I get people to yell at me, or sometimes even throw things at me, because they think in the regulatory world this is heresy. But again, don't miss my message here. I'm not saying that rules are not important, but they have to make sense. Okay, so back to the topic of today's webinar, complaints. So let's start to drill into this further. Let's start to peel back this onion even further. What is a complaint? Well, before I give you a couple of definitions of complaints, and by the way, there are many different definitions of complaints, let me give you a few of my recommendations. And this is not, from FDA, but this is based on my 30 years of experience, not just working as a regulatory and also a quality consultant, but also as a expert witness in product liability cases. Because as some of you know, I spend a growing amount of my time working as an expert witness in product liability cases. And one of the first things that I like to look at when a company gets sued is their quality management system, and what's in it and what's not in it. So a lot of times when I evaluate quality management systems for companies, they'll ask me to come in and kick the tire, so to speak. Recommendations that I give them are not necessarily from a regulatory or a quality perspective. In other words, not necessarily simply from what's written in the QSR, the quality system regulation, but what is also my experience on the product liability side. And there can be a big difference between those. So when it comes to what is a complaint, my first recommendation is create your own definition. Create your own definition. You do have liberties to do this here. Let me just jump to the next slide for a moment. This is a screenshot from one of my favorite sections of the FDA's website on the quality side. This is what I call the preamble to the QSR, to the quality system regulation. And here FDA kind of explains not necessarily what they do, but more importantly, why they do it, their approach. And by the way, their approach here, their philosophy, if you will, is spot on consistent with mine. I just want to highlight a few of the words on the screen here. First of all, I hope everybody appreciates that in the medical device world, regulation must apply to so many different types of devices that the regulation, and we're not just talking about complaints, we're talking about all regulation. The regulation does not prescribe in detail how a manufacturer must produce a specific device or handle complaints regarding a specific device. Rather, the regulation provides a framework that all manufacturers must follow by requiring the manufacturer to develop and follow procedures and fill in the details as appropriate for a given device, for a given technology, for a given company. It drives me nuts when I walk into a company, and surprisingly, this happens a lot, where their quality system their quality system is basically a carbon copy of other companies out there, or they buy a set of pre-filled forms on the internet and they use that as their quality system. In my opinion, that defeats the whole purpose of having a quality management system in place. As a matter of fact, I'll share with you just one quick anecdotal story to illustrate a company a few years ago asked me to come in and take a look at their quality system and kind of, kick the tire, so to speak. And I saw some products in there that were being described that I didn't know that the company made. And so I asked them, I said, hey, I didn't know you guys make these devices. And they said, no, Mike, we don't make them. Why do you ask? Well, because it's right here in your own quality system documentation. So if that's not the clear-cut example of people, not only are they copying and pasting, but they're copying and pasting and not even reading what they're copying and pasting. I wish I could tell you that this was a hypothetical story. I wish I could tell you that it only happened one time. The answer to both of those is no. It's happened over and over again, even in my own little experience. Continuing on, manufacturers should use good judgment. And I think that's a very, very important phrase. You have to use your own good judgment when you're developing your quality system, including your complaint handling portion of your quality system, and apply those sections of the quality system regulation that are applicable to your particular devices and your particular procedures. Because again, the medical device universe is a very broad universe, from Band-Aids to artificial hearts and everywhere in between. And it would be very, very difficult, if not impossible, probably impossible, to create regulation that on one hand was broad enough to cover that entire universe, but on the other hand, specific enough to be actionable for somebody that makes Band-Aids as well as somebody that makes artificial hearts. It just makes absolutely no sense. It's the responsibility of each manufacturer, that means you individuals in this audience and you as companies, to establish your own requirements, including complaint handling requirements for each type of family or device that will result in devices that are safe and effective. The responsibility for meeting those requirements, for having an objective evidence of meeting these requirements may not be delegated, even though the actual work might be delegated. In terms of complaint handling, some companies will farm out the complaint handling function to a third party. There's no problem with that. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. However, FDA is reminding you at the end of the second paragraph here that you can farm out the work of complaint handling. You cannot farm out the responsibility. At the end of the day, the manufacturer of record, or what I like to say, the name of the company that's at the top of the label, they are the ones that are ultimately responsible, regardless of who does the work. And finally, the essential elements of a quality system shall embody, without prescribing specific ways to establish these elements. Because the quality system regulation covers a broad spectrum of devices, as I said, from Band-Aids to artificial hearts, production process, and so on, it allows some leeway. I would argue it allows a lot of leeway, a lot of flexibility, a lot of wiggle room, a lot of gray area, a lot of area for interpretation in the details of the quality system elements, including the complaint handling portion of it. However, at the end of the day, it is left to the manufacturer, i.e. you all in this audience, to determine the necessity for or extent of some of these quality elements, including the complaint handling, and to develop and implement specific procedures tailored for your particular process and your particular devices. Again, this is one of my favorite sections of FDA's website, what I call the preamble to the QSR, because it explains the philosophy, why, in this case, the QSR is written as it broadly as it is. So coming back to where we left off, and again, as a reminder, if anybody has any questions, feel free to type them into the chat. And if anybody wants to disagree with anything that I've said, you're welcome to do that as well. So create your own definition. I'll show you some definitions in a moment. Specific examples are always nice, especially specific examples that are close to your particular device or your particular technology. When I read a complaint handling section, or indeed when I read the quality documentation, it should not be generic. It should not be for all medical devices companies. It should be for your company. It should be for your devices. So create your own definition and use specific examples to illustrate. Once you do that, that's step one, if you will, then test it. Or in other words, validate it. As an engineer, I would say, you need to validate it, right? So you come up with your own definition, then validate it by taking some existing complaints or making up some fictitious complaints and apply them to your definition of a complaint. Does that complaint, does that meet your definition? If it doesn't, and you think it's a legitimate complaint, then maybe you need to tweak your definition a little bit. So, what's the point of creating, or maybe the better word is designing your own, and I'm sorry, there's a typo there. It's supposed to be own, not OWN. Sorry about that. Own definition, and then test it or validate your design. And finally, continue to retest it or continue to revalidate it. Just like the risk management plan, where it's not supposed to be a static document. You're not supposed to do it once and then never touch it again. Your complaint handling system, specifically the definition of your complaint, it's something that you should retest, you should revisit, you should revalidate as you get more and more complaints in. If, for example, the new complaints coming in still fit your original definition of a complaint, then terrific, no problem. Nothing needs to be done. Although you should document that, once a year or once every 6 months or once every 2 years or whatever it is, you visited your complaint handling definition, your complaint definition, and there was no reason to change it, and just sign in the date, just so that if I come in and ask you when was the last time that you validated your definition of a complaint, then you can easily demonstrate that. But if I see that your definition was created, say, 5 years ago, how do I know if you've even touched it, let alone think about it since then? So document the fact that you've validated it, and document the frequency, once a month, once a year, once a decade, whatever it is. And then as you get if you get new complaints come in and they don't seem to fit the current definition of a complaint. Maybe it's a complaint that you never got before. Maybe it's a complaint that you never anticipated. It might be necessary to modify or to update, to improve your design, if you will, of your complaint definition. So this should be very much like a risk management plan. This should be a living, breathing document. And the last thing, which I see surprisingly few companies do, make sure that you interpret your definition of a complaint consistently, and make sure that you validate it consistently. In other words, especially with larger organizations where you have lots of different people handling complaints, how do I know that when Mary Smith receives a certain information and Tom Jones receives exactly the same information, that they will interpret it the same way and they will do whatever needs to be done in the same way? I have no idea if that happens unless you're able to validate that we tested it. We gave the same information to everybody on our complaint handling team and everybody got the same result. If that happens, then terrific. You've just validated your complaint handling system, or at least the people in it. If you get inconsistent results from person to person, or from location to location, or, as I said earlier, from your internal complaint handling group to your external group, if you're farming it out somewhere, if you're getting inconsistencies there, then there's a problem and you need to investigate that. Okay, continuing on. So, as I said, what's a complaint? There are actually multiple definitions that you can kind of pick from. But unfortunately, they're all very general. They're all very generic definitions. So here is the one to start with from the QSR, from the Quality System Regulation. It says a complaint means any written, electronic, or oral communication that alleges deficiency related to the identity, quality, durability, reliability, safety, effectiveness, or performance of a device after it's released for distribution. Now, FDA actually, as I'll show you in one of the next slides, FDA actually recommends using this particular definition. I'm not going to say that this particular definition is wrong or it's bad. However, I do not recommend this definition because it's way, way, way too broad. If you're making Band-Aids, the quality or the durability or the reliability of the Band-Aid is going to be very, very different than if you're making an artificial heart, or if you're making a piece of software or something like that. And I love the phrase alleges deficiency. It doesn't mean that it was actually deficient. It doesn't mean it actually did not work. It means that the person alleges. They're, to use sort of the legal metaphor, they're accusing you, or you're accusing your device didn't work, or it didn't do something that it was supposed to do. If that's the case, now your job is to be sort of the judge, if you will, is to investigate it and determine, was there in fact a deficiency? If there was, then what do we do to prevent it in the future? If there wasn't, then why did this person think there was? My recommendation here, as after this webinar, if you're, when you go back to your company, take this sort of standard, this generic definition, pick it apart word by word. For example, the first part, any written, electronic, or oral communication. What exactly does written mean? What exactly does electronic mean? What exactly does oral mean? Some of you, I'm sure, in this audience are thinking I'm being overly nitpicky and focusing too much on the semantics. And while I would agree that there is too much focus on the semantics as opposed to the big picture of the philosophy, the devil is in the details. FDA does look at the details. When I work with a company, I do look at the details. So the details, the wording is important. And as I've mentioned a moment ago, personalize it. Don't give me in your quality system manual some generic definition like you see on the screen here, because this would apply to every single medical device company on earth. What I want to know is, what's your definition? What does it mean to you? Remember the preamble to the QSR that I just shared with you a moment ago. It's up to you to sort of personalize it, if you will. So one definition that I mentioned from the CFR is the one that's reiterated on this now. Here's another different definition, a very, very different definition of a complaint from a different part of the CFR. A complaint is any indication of the failure of a device to meet a customer or user expectation or to meet performance standards. So this is a very different sort of a spin on the definition before. And again, in this short webinar, we don't have time to go through a detailed word-by-word analysis, but I strongly recommend that you and your team and your company do exactly that and figure out what portions of this second definition that you like that you can incorporate in your definition, what portions of the first definition that you like that you can incorporate into your definition, and then kind of blend them all together to come up with a one that's suitable for you. There are other definitions out there as well, and don't just look at the regulatory world. I mean, you can go to the dictionary, you can go to Wikipedia and see, what does complaint mean? Take all of these different connotations of complaint and kind of synthesize them down. So the question that sometimes people ask me when they see multiple definitions, and they ask me, Mike, which one do I use? My answer to them is very simple. Don't use any of them. At least don't use them out of the box. Take them all and synthesize them. And at the end of the day, use the one that's your own. As I said a moment ago, in terms of a device-related complaint, FDA recommends this particular one in the guidance. But as I said, this is not my recommendation because it's too generic, it's too broad, it's too general, it's too nonspecific. I have no idea what those things mean. Well, I'm being a bit facetious, but I'm trying to make a point. I have no idea what this means in the context of a specific device or a specific technology. Also, remember that according to the regulation, manufacturers, meaning you all in this audience, are required to review and evaluate all medical device related to determine whether the complaint represents an MDR reportable event. Well, first of all, what does review and evaluate mean? That's something that we could have an interesting discussion on. But remember, when I showed you the statistics a few minutes ago, the most common why companies get 483s is right on the screen is one of them, is that they don't review and evaluate all of their complaints. So they're clearly not following, never mind the spirit of the law. In this case, they're not even following the letter of the law. And believe me, it doesn't take a JD after your name from Harvard or Hopkins or someplace like that. If you're in a product liability situation, and I can say to the as an expert witness to the jury that the company didn't do this, and this is clearly required in the regulation, it doesn't take a JD from Harvard after your name to hear in your mind, ka-ching, ka-ching, ka-ching. This is such a boneheaded mistake. It's just amazing that it's one of the top reasons why companies get 43 observations. So not sufficiently investigating, or in some cases not investigating complaints at all. One of the most common reasons why companies get 43 observations and sometimes even warning letters from the FDA. So as a quick example, using, just for the sake of time, that first definition as an example, the key items, the key portions of that definition for a complaint, the QSR definition. Any communication, remember, written, oral, electronic, whatever, an alleged deficiency, and after the product has been released. Sort of an interesting question. Can you have a complaint about a product prior to release? For example, if you have a complaint, in a clinical trial or something like that, but that's a little beyond the scope of this particular we'll leave that one alone. So here's an example. A particular device has been on the market for 3 years, and a user calls you up one day and says, I went to use your device and the handle came off. I think it was broken when it arrived. The question is this a complaint? Well, we have to analyze it. And what I mean by that is we have to apply what our definition of a complaint is to the information provided by the user. So let's do that very, very quickly. So is it a communication? Yes, they called me or they called our company and they told us that. Does it allege deficiency? Yes, they said, I think it was broken. So that is a deficiency. The assumption here, of course, is that the handle was not supposed to be attached to the device when it was delivered to the user. In some cases, maybe the handle is purposely not attached to the device, and maybe that's something that the user is supposed to do before using the device, is attach the handle. Kind of like when you buy, I don't know, a bicycle or a toaster at Walmart, you have to kind of put it together. Assuming that the device is not supposed to be put together by the user, then this would be a deficiency. If the device was intended to be put together by the user, this is technically not a deficiency. However, it does make me ask, why did the user have the expectation that it would come out of the box pre-assembled, if you will? Did we not make that clear in the directions for use? Did they not read the directions for use? Do we need to make it more evident on the labeling? So even if you determine that the complaint is not a deficiency, you should still investigate it to see if there's something that you can do to mitigate or prevent this problem from happening in the future. And finally, the third criteria, is the product on the market? Yeah, the product's been on the market for 3 years, so we tick that box as well. So this appears, and again, I put that word appears in quotes for reasons. This appears to meet the definition of a complaint, but the question is, does it meet your definition of a complaint? At the end of the day, you cannot resolve a complaint one way or the other without, at the very, very beginning, making sure you have a good definition, preferably a personalized or a customized definition of the word complaint. Because if we can't define complaint precisely, then how do we know if we've resolved the complaint or not? It's impossible to know. So once you do get this information, what do you do with this information? First of all, don't be afraid of it. It's amazing to me how many people they just freak out when they get complaints. Welcome it. You maybe not be happy about it. That might not be a little bit of an exaggeration, but you should welcome it in the sense that it is feedback. Even if it's negative feedback, it is feedback. And this is where you have to be a little bit careful here, because this is where the regulatory advice and the product liability advice are diametrically opposed. As a matter of fact, let me just share with you. I think it's. Did I put it as the next slide? Let me just share this particular slide with you for a moment. Martin Lamosi said, never write when you can speak, never speak when you can nod, and never nod when you can wink. Or another way to put that is never talk when you can nod, never nod when you can wink, and never ever write an email because it's the kiss of death. You're giving prosecutors all the evidence that we need. So you're really, really careful when it comes to complaint handling and documentation, not just from a regulatory perspective, but from a product liability perspective. And there is sort of a fine line. It's a little beyond the scope of this particular webinar to give examples, but if this is something that any of you are interested in, feel free to either contact me or ask me about during the Q&A, and I'd be happy to go into it further. So first of all, welcome the feedback, welcome the complaints. Second of all, act on it. Don't sit on it. I mean, this is just, I'm laughing when I say this because quite frankly, I shouldn't have to say it. But remember, another reason why, one of the most common reasons why companies got 483s and especially warning letters is because they got complaints that they didn't investigate. So in other words, they got this information, they just sat on it, they didn't act on it. That to me is just, I can't even put into words. And finally, document what you did and what you did not do with this information. It's interesting, this comes back to the product liability piece. A lot people will document what they do, but most people don't document what they don't do and why you don't do it. But as I'm going to show you in a moment, there is that regulatory requirement. If you feel that it's not necessary to investigate a complaint for whatever reason or reasons, fine, no problem. But you have to document it. And again, I'm not necessarily saying a 300-page dissertation, but a couple of sentences, a couple of paragraphs. This is the complaint. This is why it's not necessary to investigate it further, and all the following reasons, and then the sign off on and the date, and you're done. So essentially, you're documenting what you didn't do in this particular case. You're documenting that you didn't investigate the complaint, and here are the reasons why. That, and in my opinion, is sufficient. If an FDA inspector, or if myself, somebody else comes into your company and says, "Hey, I see you got this complaint, a few months ago. What did you do with that?" And you just say to them, "Well, we didn't." If you don't have proof that you didn't investigate it, and if you don't have reasoning that you didn't investigate it, then how the heck is anybody, the FDA inspector or myself, gonna believe you? I'm a big fan of the old Ronald Reagan mantra: trust but verify. So if you make a decision to not investigate a complaint, and again, no problem doing that in the correct circumstances, but document the fact that you're not investigating it and why. I hate to say it, but do I really need to tell you? Apparently I do, because remember those statistics I shared with you at the end of the webinar. These are some of the most common reasons why companies get in trouble under the area of complaint handling. So properly and adequately investigate complaints. And I love these phrases like properly and adequately, because with all due respect, what the heck does that mean? I have no idea. And I'm being facetious, but I am trying to make a point here. So, we had time to go into very, very specific examples, but I know, just like the medical device universe, you're coming from a broad audience. So let me give you some of my general recommendations. Simply put, have you identified the root cause of the problem? Have you figured out what the actual root cause of the complaint was? And I'm putting that phrase, root cause, in italics and underlining for a reason, because as a biomedical engineer, I frequently see people talking about the root cause of a problem, when in fact it is not the actual root cause. It's just a superficial manifestation of a much more deeper root cause. So have you identified the actual root cause of the problem? And then the second question is, how do you know that it's the actual root cause? In other words, how do you know that there isn't actually another problem underneath it that is the real root cause causing the problem? This is something that I see in the Kappa world all the time, because corrective action, preventative action. And by the way, it's always bothered me, why the heck do we call it a Kappa, a corrective action, preventative action? That's backwards. We should call it a PACA, a preventive action, corrective action. The emphasis here should be on the prevention, not the correction. But it's another example of how we work in such a reactive industry. It's a Kappa. If we worked in a proactive industry, and I know people say that we're proactive, but I don't see a lot of evidence of that. If we did work in a proactive industry, then why wouldn't we call it a PACA rather than a Kappa? In any event, how do you really know that it's the root cause? Because if you solve this problem, but in fact it is not root cause, then you're just treating the symptom of the underlying disease, and you're going to get that symptom to come back, or you're going to get other symptoms to come back. So have you identified the root cause, and how do you know that it's the root cause? These questions apply to the medical device universe across the board. Simply put, if you can't answer those two questions, and more importantly, if you can't defend your answer, this is how I know it was the root cause, then you have not, in my opinion, properly and adequately investigated the complaint. And you better keep an eye out on your mailbox for a 483, because sooner or later, you're probably going to get one, if not something worse, like a warning letter. Can a complaint be positive? And I know we're coming up to the end of our time, so just a few more points real quick, and then I'll open this up to Q&A. So if you have questions, once again, please go ahead and type them into the chat. Can complaints be positive? Well, most people would probably say no. And I understand their justification for that, because as I mentioned earlier, just simply using the word complaint, that has a bit of a negative tone to it. We're putting a negative spin on it. And I think that's not the approach here. We should think about this as feedback. My answer is yes, complaints can be positive. But there's a terminology problem here. Why do we call complaints? In my opinion, that's inherently biased. It's focusing on the negative. And this is why sometimes people quibble about, is complaint handling part of post-market surveillance? It kind of depends on how you define the word complaint. If complaint is only defined in the negative sense, then most people would say absolutely it's part of post-market surveillance. And by the way, I talked about your quality system many times. There should be multiple links between your post-market surveillance portion of your QMS and your complaint handling portion of your QMS and your CAPA portion and your risk portion. They should all be interlinked together. So if you define complaints in a negative sense, as many people do, then absolutely it's part of your post-market surveillance. However, if you take a broader connotation, as I do, of the word complaints, that would also include the positives, or the suggestions that a customer might make. Hey, I'm using your balloon cat, but if you make it a little longer or a little shorter, it might be better, or something like that. That might, the question is, could you define that as a complaint? Well, part of one of the definitions that I showed you of a complaint earlier is it alleges a deficiency. Well, a oncologist is using your balloon catheter for angioplasty, for example, and he or she says that your balloon is too short, or your balloon is too small, or too big, or whatever it is. That could be construed as a deficiency, a design deficiency, and therefore that could be construed as a complaint. So again, I don't want to be too much into the semantics here. That's why I just have such a problem using the word complaint to begin with, even though it shows up hundreds, if not thousands of times in the regulation. That's part of the problem that we run into here. How underreporting impact complaint handling? This is a topic that we could have a whole other webinar on. Maybe someday I might, but underreporting is a lot more common than some people might think. And there's a lot of statistics on this, but I'm just going to share a couple of them from this particular article. It's evident that adverse event reporting, another way of saying complaint handling, if you will, not exactly the same, but similar, does not occur to a great extent, with a rate of reporting estimated to be as low as 0.5%, 5% of all occurrences. As a matter of fact, FDA estimates the reporting rate to be about 0.5%. Well, you don't have to have a PhD in math to appreciate that that the vast majority of adverse events, the vast majority of complaints, for a variety of different reasons, are simply not being reported to FDA and are not being reported to the manufacturer. That's a big problem. And there's a lot of other statistics similar along these lines. If you're interested, send me an email. I'll be happy to send you some of them. But bottom line, underreporting happens much more than many people might think. Remember what Carl Sagan, late great Carl Sagan, said: the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. I can't tell you how many times people in companies tell me, or better, when I'm sitting on the FDA side of the table and a company says, we don't have evidence of a particular problem happening, therefore it doesn't. Well, I was not in China this morning to see it, but I'm pretty sure that the sun came up in China. I don't have data to support it. I don't have evidence, but I'm pretty sure that it did. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And on the post-market surveillance side, this is another reason why active market surveillance is becoming so much more important today compared to the passive post-market surveillance that we've done in the past. Because just simply relying for information to come to you, it's not a very good thing to do, because of the statistics that I shared with you a moment ago. So what are the complaint handling challenges for the future? And again, we're going to wrap this up in just a couple of more minutes. Well, one of them, can you say 3D printing, also known as what I call personalized medicine, right? Many people think of personalized medicine in terms of drugs, and we're definitely doing that. I work in that area as well. But personalized medical devices are the future. So it's one thing if you're making, thousands or millions of medical devices that are being used by, the same devices being used by lots of people, and you get a complaint on that. But what if you make one medical device for one patient? How does that happen? Impact how you do your post-market surveillance? How does that impact how you do your complaint handling? for right now, because of the sake of time, and this is sort of a general overview, I'll leave that as a rhetorical question. But suffice it to say, the regulation doesn't even come close to addressing any of those questions. But because of some of the more advanced areas that I work in, like 3D printing, which I've been working in for actually quite a long time now, these are not nearly as far off problems or questions as some people might think. So the last thing that I want to mention, the bonus question that I decided to throw in, and then I'll wrap this up and we'll have a few minutes for when should a complaint or several complaints, when should that initiate a CAPA? This is another area where a lot of companies get in trouble because, unfortunately, there's no specific guidance in the quality system regulation to tell companies or to remind companies that, gee, maybe it's a good idea to have some criteria in your quality system so that, you know, when you get these complaints and when you investigate and you track these complaints, you should also be asking yourself a question, well, at what do we need to do something more about it in the form of an investigation and possibly even a CAPA, or as I like to call it, a PACA would be a better example here. As I said before, why the heck do we call it a CAPA, a corrective action, preventative action? Why not instead call it a preventive action, a corrective action, a PACA? But back to the original question, most, if not all, medical device companies is that you should have specific criteria. Again, don't give me very generic, very high level, touchy feely, you know, rainbow and unicorn universe verbiage. Give me very specific terms and very specific examples for your particular devices and your technology of under what circumstances a complaint will initiate a CAPA. Perhaps you might even do the opposite. Under what circumstances would it not justify a CAPA? If you haven't done that already, and I guess maybe to be nice, I won't fault you for it because it's not really required, but in my opinion, it's obvious. It's you know, if we call ourselves medical device professionals, it's something that we know that we should do. So if you have those criteria already, terrific. If you don't have them, you should create them. And then my second recommendation is, just like we talked about before with the definition of the complaints, these criteria should not be static. Periodically, again, whether it's once a month, once a year, once a decade, periodically, you should go back and test those criteria, excuse me, to make sure that those criteria are still appropriate. Maybe you got some new information that did trigger a CAPA, but it didn't trigger a CAPA because of your complaint CAPA transition criteria to begin with. Okay, fair enough. We're all learning things all the time. You need to go back and you need to update the criteria in order to reflect this new information. It's the basic concept out of the design controls. Like your design outputs become your design inputs in the next version of the device. Or that's actually not unique to the design controls. That actually comes from basic physiology, evolutionary biology. You know, that's the concept of feedback in the nervous system or the endocrine system. So it's feedback. So I'm just simply suggesting that apply that same feedback, if you will, here. We don't need more regulation. You know, as a regulatory concern, some people would say, Mike, you know, aren't for more regulation? No, as a matter of fact, on the contrary, I'm adamantly against more regulation most of the time, because more often than not, when new regulation is created, it actually creates additional problems, and sometimes the additional problems are bigger than the problems that we try to solve. So not only am I not usually an advocate for creating new regulation, what I do advocate, though, is understanding the regulation that we do have and being able to apply it in different ways. It's the difference between what I call the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. Don't focus so much on the letter of the law. Yeah, you have to understand what the letter of the law says to begin with, but more importantly, focus on the spirit of the law. So at this point, I'm sure you've probably had enough. I just want to wrap this up by reminding you quickly of what we talked about today. We talked about what constitutes a complaint. We talked about what you do with this information. How does underreporting impact complaint handling? We talked about some ways to make sure that you properly investigate your complaints. Can complaints be positive? We talked about some of the complaint handling challenges for the future, like 3D printing. And I threw in the bonus question there: when should a complaint initiate a CAPA? I've given you a number of tips and tricks as well. And now let me just wrap this up with a couple quick final thoughts, and then Lisa, we can open it up to some Q&A, and you can moderate it at that point. There's a lot of regulatory and quality consultants out there, but in my opinion, there are very, very few good ones. I used to teach medical school back in the day, and I was constantly reminded of the old joke. What do you call the person that graduates last in their class in medical school? Doctor. But we can say the same thing about lawyers and about engineers, and dare I say it, about regulatory professionals as well. So there's a lot of regulatory professionals out there, but there's not a lot of good ones. So how do you become a good one if that's your goal, or how do you find a good one if that's your goal? Simple. Learn when to follow, but more importantly, learn when to lead. If it's to my advantage to follow in somebody else's footsteps, or then terrific, and I'll put that on my on my PowerPoint slide in 72-point font at the FDA. I'm doing exactly what the people did before me. I'm doing exactly what the regulation says. End of discussion. Don't let the door hit you in the you-know-what on the way out. On the other hand, if it's not possible or appropriate for me to follow in somebody else's footsteps, then I will be the first to work with the FDA to figure out a way to make more sense. Because at the end of the day, if you want to lead the orchestra, you must first turn your back on the crowd. And I apologize, maybe I need to gender neutralize this phrase in the politically correct, hypersensitive society that we live today. That's why I'm doing it verbally. If a person wants to lead the orchestra, you must first turn your back on the crowd. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of people in this industry, certainly in the regulatory and quality area, that seem to be willing, perhaps even able, to do that. Finally, if you can think it, we can do it. I really believe that. Einstein, very smart guy, Einstein said that imagination is more important than knowledge. For while knowledge points to all there is, imagination points to all that could be. I really believe that. I really think that anything is possible. And Einstein also said that logic will get you from A to B, but imagination will take you anywhere. So I think I'll skip this last one. So at this point, I want to reserve the last minutes that we have today for Q&A. But before we officially I just want to thank everybody in the audience for sitting through today's webinar. I hope you found it valuable. Hopefully, maybe you found it interesting, maybe even fun, or I'll settle for the word different if you want to categorize my approach different compared to maybe the approaches of other people that you've heard. I'll be happy with that. If there's anything that I can do to help you in the future, feel free to contact me. You've got my phone, you've got my email. Call me or send me an email. I'm happy to help however I can. Lisa, at this point, I'll turn it over to you to kind of facilitate some Q&A and to wrap things up.
That sounds great. All right, I'm going to share our first question. I will put it up on the screen today. David Hicks asks, although today is focused on 483s, I assume that much of this will be applicable for 13485.
Yeah, great question, David. And I said, I would agree with your statement. Most of it, there would be some differences. Again, I would be happy to get into those in a little bit more detail. But bottom line, I think there's a heck of a lot more similarities, differences. If I can, David, to use a regulatory pun intentionally, I would say that they're substantially equivalent.
I think that makes sense. Excellent. All right, our next question. Let me see if I can share it here. From Sean, what is FDA's expectation of initial importers of devices from foreign manufacturers for evaluating and investigating complaints?
Lisa, I'm sorry. Can you time, please?
Oh, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yeah, just read the question once more, please.
For sure. Yep. It's also up on the screen. If can you see that up there? What is
actually?
Oh, that's okay. I'll read it.
Go ahead.
I'll read it. What is FDA's expectation of initial importers of devices from foreign manufacturers for evaluating and investigating complaints?
Okay, good question. There gets to be some legalities here, and I am not, nor do I play one on TV. So I want to, give you the information. But as a general rule, I would go back to what that I said earlier in today's webinar, and that is the manufacturer of record. That is, whatever company's name is at the top of the label, they're the ones that are ultimately responsible, not just in a regulatory sense, but also in a liability sense. Now, I don't know in this case, because I've seen situations, handled differently. If a company is importing the device from some other company outside the US that's manufacturing it, if the importer is considered the manufacturer of record, then they would be ultimately responsible for everything, including complaint handling. On the other hand, if the importer is, I don't know, maybe more like a distributor, but the manufacturer of record is still the foreign company, then they would be the ones that ultimately are responsible. So to give you more specific advice in your particular situation, I would advise you to talk to an attorney or somebody who knows more about this specific area than what I do. But simply put, at the end, who's responsible for complaint handling? Yeah, that's important. But to me, what's much, much more important is that somebody does collect the information, and then, as I said earlier, doesn't just sit on it, that does something with it, that investigates it, whether it's the importer that then passes that information back on to the manufacturer or whoever. Somebody needs to actually do it. So I don't know, that's probably not a direct answer to the question, but it's as close of an answer as I can give you.
Great. Thank you, Mike. All right. Our next question is, hold on a second. This is, what is MedWatch and its role for complaint submissions?
Great question. And I purposely pared this down to try to get this webinar in an hour or a tiny bit more than an hour. There are a variety of tools, of databases you can access through FDA's website. MedWatch is one, the MAUDE database. There's, to get complaint-related information. So in the traditional sense, the connotation of complaints is usually information that's reported directly to the manufacturer. But when you broaden it out a little bit, and you consider, under the umbrella of post-market surveillance, and as I kind of alluded to earlier, passive post-market surveillance versus active post-market, that would include accessing databases like MedWatch, like MAUDE, like and even the popular press. I believe, this is my professional belief, that companies have an obligation to keep an eye on not just their devices while they're on their market, and don't just rely on the information that's reported to you, but go out and actively look for it using any and all of the tools, not just the regulatory databases on FDA's website, but the popular press, the Wall Street Journal, Times, and so on. The company has the obligation to do that, and not just for your own device, by the way, but for similar devices. And Lisa, if I can go off on a small tangent here, I've been involved in several product cases where a manufacturer of a 510K device has gotten sued. And part of the reasons why I can get a big judgment for the plaintiff is because I can show that not only did the company not know, or did they not do enough to mitigate this particular problem, but oh, by the way, there was also evidence of the same or similar problem happening to other similar devices in that same product code. And if you bring your device onto the market as a 510K, showing that it's substantially equivalent, particularly the same as another device, it stands to reason that if there's a problem with the other device, then there's at least the possibility that there might be a similar problem with your device. I mean, does it really take a PhD or an MD or an RAC after your name to kind of connect those dots? Or at least it shouldn't. Go ahead, Lisa, your turn.
Excellent. Perfect. I appreciate that. Definitely something I've encountered before. All right. So I've got another question here. Is Greenlight's customer feedback environment enough to satisfy the trending requirements? Mike, I'm not sure how familiar you are with the Greenlight Guru platform in that regard. I can say, as a medical device guru, and speaking from my own experience in the management world, is that what you trend on can be exported from Greenlight Guru. The data that you enter into our customer feedback workspace can be exported as a CSV file, and then you can play with that data for your trending needs, whether it be based on device type or complaint type, and that kind of thing. But maybe, Mike, you could expand a little bit on what types of trending should you be doing in your customer feedback?
Yeah, good question, Lisa. And by the way, thank you for chiming in on that first, because obviously you're an employee of Greenlight Guru. I'm not. I've got a really great relationship with Greenlight for about a decade now, but but I'm not an employee of the company, so I don't speak for Greenlight. Just mentioning that for the benefit of our audience. So what I think is most important here, and thank you for that question, by the way. I think it was a very, very good question. What I think here is more important than the Greenlight information, as it's sort of been called in the question. What's more important to me is the quality or the detail of that information. Let me give you a perfect example. So when I started out in this business about a little over 30 years ago as an R&D engineer, designing and developing and testing medical devices myself, one of the things that I spent a fair amount of my time doing is what we call failure mode recreation or failure mode analysis. In other words, you get a complaint from the field that my device didn't work right. And now we have to kind of figure out, okay, what was the root cause of that problem? Why did it happen? Was it a design issue? Was it a manufacturing issue? Was it a user issue? There could be a number of different root causes. And a surprising number of times, I did not have the level of detail necessary to recreate the circumstances to lead to that particular failure mode. And if I don't have the detail to recreate those circumstances, it's going to be very, very difficult for me, probably impossible for me to identify, certainly not definitively identify the root cause if I am not confident in recreating the circumstances that led to it. So again, this is a little bit beyond the scope of this webinar, but it is something that I talk about in much more detail in my longer course. Make sure that when you have that customer on the phone, if they're calling in, for example, that you ping them in detail, because that's your best opportunity to get the most information out of them as you possibly can. Can you go back to them later and try to get additional information? Yeah, theoretically you can, but logistically it's very, very possible, very, very difficult to do, especially if the information is coming from a physician or a surgeon. Obviously their time is very, very limited. If it's like, days or weeks, afterwards, they might have forgotten. So the best opportunity, again, Greenlight is a wonderful platform for doing this, but what I'm trying to say here is in my opinion, in a way, there's a more important message. The best opportunity to get the information, regardless of, whether you type it into Greenlight or something else, is when that person is on the phone with you, or when you're receive that email from them and you want to ping them back, or you want to say, hey, can I set up a call with you for a couple of minutes to talk about this further. I hope, Lisa, I didn't overstep my bounds on that one a little bit, but I wanted to just kind of amplify what you said.
Yes, that's what I was hoping that you would do. So perfect. All right. This question has some of the most votes, and it's pretty extensive. So I'm going to try to read it out here. So according to the 21 CFR 820.198 complaint files, any complaint involving the possible failure of a device, labeling, or packaging to meet any of its specifications shall be reviewed, evaluated, and investigated, unless such investigation has already been performed for a similar complaint and another investigation is not necessary. The question is, considering that another investigation is not necessary for a complaint if one has been conducted for a similar complaint, what extent of investigation is required before you can say that this is a similar complaint? In other words, what do you have to do to show that they are similar?
Yeah, great question. And by the way, that last part, what do you do to show that it's similar? Again, I can't help but use the not the irony, the kind of here, substantial equivalence. How do you show that two devices are substantially equivalent? How do you show that two complaints are substantially equivalent? The regulatory logic is exactly the same. But I'll come back to that in a second. Back to the original question. I think I answered that question, but maybe indirectly. So let me give a more direct answer. The portion of the regulation that you just quoted from that question, Lisa, is exactly correct. One of the outs that FDA gives you for not investigating a complaint is if the complaint has happened before and you investigated it before. And, quite frankly, to me, that's a statement of the obvious, because why reinvent the wheel? Although it does beg the question, if this complaint happened before and now it happened again, why is it happening again? In other words, apparently you didn't act on the original complaint to try to the root cause of the problem, because if you did, then why is the same complaint happening again? But if you have, in fact, seen the same complaint before, and if you've investigated before, then all you need to do is, in a couple of sentences, just explain. In this, should be documented in your document control system somewhere in your complaint handling section. You should document that this complaint is similar to the previous complaint, and if you can refer to the date, or you can refer to the complaint number, or logistically how you handle it, put a pointer to that complaint. Then after that, you say, this is my substantial equivalence argument. This is why these two complaints are in fact similar, because don't just assume that somebody else like me is going to see it as similar. It's your job as the manufacturer to convince me that they're trust but verify. So you put that little summary, and again, I'm not talking 300 pages. It might be just a few lines. Maybe it might be a page or a couple of pages. It depends on the nature of the complaint, obviously. And then at the end, you everybody signs it and you date it, and you're done. And that way you have covered your what. And so when an FDA inspector comes in, or somebody like me comes in and says, hey, you've got this complaint, and it looks like it's similar to this complaint 6 months ago, but you didn't investigate it. Why the heck not? You can point to that. So when I said a moment ago, Lisa, I think I answered that question indirectly when I said, don't just document what you did, but document what you didn't do. So in this particular case, I'm documenting what I didn't do, and I'm documenting why I didn't do it. I'm documenting the fact that I investigated this complaint because I did before, and I documented it before, and now I'm documenting it again. You understand the logic there, I think.
I do.
Does that make sense?
I think so. All right. I've got another very popular question here. What are the validation methods used to validate the complaint handling system?
Great question. And again, this is something that unfortunately I see very, very few companies do, perhaps because it's not explicitly required in the QSR. Maybe it should be. And in light of the statistics that I showed you at today's webinar, it probably should be, but I would like to think that it's obvious. But okay, so how do we validate it? By the way, if anybody's interested, a few years ago, I did a webinar for Greenlight I called it Validating Your Validation, because I see a lot of companies doing validations, and it turns out that you're validating the wrong thing. What's the point of doing a validation if you're validating the wrong thing? And it actually happens more frequently than some people might think. So if you're interested, check out Greenlight's website. You can find that webinar. If you can't, just send me an email. I'll be happy to send you the link. But how do you validate, in this particular case, your complaint handling system? I think it's quite easy to do. Take an existing complaint, or better, take a fictitious complaint. In other words, make up something about your product and submit it sort of blindly, anonymously, if you will, to different parts. If you have, for example, it depends on your company, obviously, but let's say you have, I'd pick a number, 10 different people in your complaint handling department that are responsible for handling complaints and intaking complaints. Give that same information to each of those same people, and then track that information as it moves through your system. And if all of the information is processed the same way, in other words, if everybody comes to the same conclusion, then terrific, you've validated your complaint handling system. But if you do this little experiment, and it's not a hypothetical, I strongly recommend that you do it. If you do this experiment and 3 people come up with this result and 7 people come up with this other result, or they're split by down the middle, or perhaps 10 different people come up with 10 different results. Now you know there's a problem somewhere. Now you know that you've got to either go back to your complaint definition, you've got to maybe go back to your training, whatever it is, but at the very least, you know that there's a problem somewhere. And then last that I'll mention this, Lisa, and then, we can drill into this one further since you said it was a popular question, or we could go on to another one. I'll leave it up to you. But the last suggestion there is from a product liability perspective. If a company gets a complaint, for example, and doesn't act on it or doesn't investigate it sufficiently, and I can show the jury as an expert witness that another company got a complaint and acted on it differently, then once again, it doesn't take a JD from Harvard after your name, ka-ching, ka-ching, ka-ching. So I think it's very, very important. As a biomedical engineer, it's very important to think about validating your complaint handling system. Whoever answered that question, I don't know who it was, but whoever asked that question, thank you for asking. It was a good question.
That's great. That was from Vivek. All right. I've got another one for you that is pretty popular from Sarah Vannan. At what point would you say a service call turns into a complaint or should be registered as a complaint?
Yeah, great question, Sarah. And again, this is something that I get into in my longer course. I'm guessing maybe Sarah might already know the answer to this question because there is specific regulation on this as well that defines this. And if you're not aware of it, send me an email. I'll be happy to send it to you. But simply put, if something is routine service, for example, if you're using I don't know, if you're using like I'm tempted to say respirator, but that's sort of a charged topic today with the whole Philips situation going on. But if you have a respirator and periodically, after X number of months or after X number of uses, then you have to replace a part like a filter or something. That is not a complaint because that's expected service. However, in the context of doing that expected service, if the technician is removing the filter, but by the way, just kind of coincidentally notices that there's a problem with another part that's not routine maintenance, then even though that was not reported to you externally by a customer, that should still be logged as a complaint. And I apologize as I think about it. Maybe I should have added this earlier. A complaint doesn't necessarily have to come from an external source. It doesn't necessarily have to come from the user or from the customer. It could come from an internal source, like the one that Sarah was alluding to a minute ago. So just to recap, because I think this is important and I want to make sure everybody understands. If it's normal service, like changing the oil on your car. Everybody knows that after, a certain number of months or certain number of miles, you have to change or you're supposed to change the oil in your car, right? That would not be a complaint. But if you take your car in and the technician notices that when they're doing the oil change that, but your fan belt's got a crack on it and it might break soon, that is a complaint. And that's something that should be handled internally in the company as a complaint. I hope that makes sense, Lisa. And again, Sarah, thank you for that question.
I think so, for sure. Okay, I've got another one here. Somewhere I gotta find it. Okay, this one I actually populated. So when you create your own definition of a complaint or you suggest creating that definition, do you intend to suggest that you shouldn't necessarily remove those minimum requirements in the FDA's definition, but you can maybe modify or expand on them? At minimum, you should probably at least do that.
Yeah, great question. And again, thank you for the opportunity to clarify my advice because I don't want to be misunderstood. Remember, I'm not saying that rules are not important, but specifically when it comes to this question, here's exactly how I would frame it. And by the way, this is something that I recommend putting in the preamble to your quality system. The preamble is the opportunity for you to, kind of like FDA did on their website, explain how we're going to interpret or enforce the quality requirements for our particular company, for our particular devices and technologies. Some people call that a quality manual. I don't like to use that phrase, quality manual, because to me, quality manual, especially for people outside of regulatory and quality, that means the whole. I specifically like to call it the preamble, but again, semantics aside, Shakespeare said a rose made on the name, it still smells as sweet. Doesn't matter what you call it. I would put it at the beginning of your document, or in this case, the beginning of your complaint handling system. And this is exactly how I would do it. I would say, according to CFR 820, blah, 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 here is the textbook example, the textbook definition of a complaint. Put that in, as a direct quote, with double indents and so on. And then after that, because our company makes certain, these certain devices or uses these kinds of technologies, here is our, you don't want to call it personalized or customized, call it more specific definition, our working definition of a complaint. And you just show almost like a substantial equivalence argument. You show that our definition is substantially equivalent to FDA's definition, but the difference is, because remember, the substantial equivalence says the two devices have to be similar. They don't have to be the same. I'm using exactly the same regulatory logic here. I hope everybody in the audience appreciates the regulatory logic. We show that our definition is based on FDA's definitions, plural, not singular, plural, but at the same time, specific. It focuses, instead of just saying the word quality. Okay, here's what quality means in our device context and so on. Because remember, whether I'm doing a Band-Aid or an artificial heart or something in between, it's going to be different. So I hope that clarifies question. Once again, excellent question. Thank you for asking that.
Perfect. All right. One last question, and then we will wrap up. And I'm actually going to combine a couple of questions here. So what do you do with an anonymous complaint that lacks information or lack of cooperation from a complainant, which interferes with the investigation of the root cause? And there was another question too that was kind of similar. What if they don't send the device back? You can't get a sample of the device that may or may not have malfunctioned. There's no testing you can do. What do you do when you can't get the information?
Great questions. And these are problems that I've run into countless times over the various ways, shapes, and forms. Look, in spite of our best attempts to get all of the information that we can, as I shared with you as an R&D engineer, when I did failure mode recreation, very, very frequently did not get enough information to failure mode, at least not to a high degree of certainty. But that's not to say that you can't try. You do have an obligation, and the lawyers, that you have, I don't remember what the phrase that they use is. You have to use reasonable measures to do what you can, to find out what you can. In that first situation where you get the information, but it's inadequate and it's anonymous, because it's anonymous, I suppose it's going to be difficult for you to go back to the person or the source where that information came from, because you might not know who they are. Although if it came in via email, maybe there's a way that you can identify them that way. Or if it came in from via telephone, maybe it showed up on the caller ID, and call back the number and say, hey, I received this, a call from this number. Are you the person that called, or something like that? So to me, that would make a reasonable attempt. And if you can't, I would document the fact that we tried to call back the number in our caller ID, and there was either no answer, or the person didn't know what we were talking about, or we tried to send an email back, but there was no answer, or the person didn't know what we talked about. At least that way, document the fact that you tried to do something. That's better than just simply doing nothing, because then if FDA or somebody else, beats you up and says, hey, you didn't investigate this first, well, okay, I agree with you, but what would you have done in my situation, right? We didn't get all the information. We tried to find out who gave us the information, but we were unable to do that. What else can we do? In the second part of the question, Lisa, in terms of not getting the device back, and this happens frequently as well, especially when you're talking about devices that go into people's bodies. Once again, you got to do what you can. Maybe you can, if it's if it's a surgical device, for example, that there was an allegation of a complaint when the device was being implanted, but you didn't get the device back for whatever reasons. And sometimes they don't want to give you a device back for all the obvious reasons, namely because of product liability, not just for the company, but for the hospital and for the physician. Not saying that that happens in the real world. It's purely hypothetical. In fact, it could never happen in the world. I hope everybody appreciates my not so subtle use of humor there. But in that case, if you don't get the device back, maybe you can interview the surgeon or the other people that were in the ER or the people that was using the device, whatever the device is, and say, hey, can you, as best as you can, describe the circumstances to me, what led to this particular problem, or in your opinion, what do you think caused the problem, something like that. As long as the company does, what they reasonably can be expected to do, I think the company has covered their, what. But what I get frustrated with is sometimes when companies don't do even just small things like making a phone call or sending an email or trying to do a little bit of investigation, even when, as these questions alluded to, even for reasons we don't have all the information that we would like to have.